You're tuned in to RX Radio.
All right, welcome back. Another episode of RX Radio solo today. I know you guys have been listening along for the last couple of months. Usually it's Gento with the solo cast, but he's mid-relocation, so still waiting for the Wi-Fi to get set up. So here I am. And I'm curious because it's almost like I want to do, remember those like dating games, those like old school dating games where they like sequester the one person away and they ask the other person like a ton of questions. I'm going to tell Jay the premise of this episode, and I'm going to have him record his version of it. And I'm curious to see how closely our answers overlap. And it's going to be about your favorite exercise. I'm going to go through and outline my favorite exercises, or what I think to be the best exercises per muscle group in the body, but in the context of the entire list. So I think a lot of times when people break down best muscle or best exercise per muscle group, they go about it in a way where it's, if they were stuck in a vacuum and they could just train one exercise per muscle group or per that muscle group, they pick it that way. I'm going to pick mine in consideration of all of the other muscle groups, so all of the other exercises. So you'll see how this will change a bit as we go through. So I may, in a normal context, if someone's like the best exercise for quads is X, are they factoring in the best exercise for quads in conjunction with the decision that they make for the best exercises for glutes, right? Like a lot of times it's sort of just this mass prescription that gets sort of laid out through the paper towel roll, sort of this myopic lens of a single muscle group. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to kind of explain my logic behind if I were to assemble exercises that I would do, the best exercises per muscle group in relation to all the other ones. So not just in like this microcosm of the single muscle group itself. So before we get started, it's Wednesday, October 29th. It is the last chance to sign up for Prescript Level 1 this semester. This semester started on Monday, but we actually have 2 lectures left this week that you can hop into. So if you go to www.pre-script.com, registration will be open for the next 48 hours. If you're hearing this past the 1st, if you're hearing this past November 1st, registration is closed. Head on over to prescript.com or pre-script.com and put your name on the wait list for next semester. All right, bills are paid. Let's get started. So I want to start lower body first. So when we're looking at the lower body, and really when we look at all of these exercises, there's sort of 2 things we're going to be weighing in mind. We're going to be weighing in the isolated output of that particular exercise and its ability to stimulate and challenge the particular muscle group. But we're also going to look at movement qualities that those exercises possess and require. And we're going to try and cover both bases as far as the underlying movement qualities. And this, we're talking, trunk rotation, hip internal rotation, frontal plane, pelvic control, internal rotation of the hip, internal rotation of the tibia, pronation and supination of the foot. These are all movement qualities that exist in varying degrees across movements that require these joints to be active. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of factor that in to make sure that we're kind of touching ground and maintaining and challenging a lot of these movement qualities, but doing so in a way that we have really loadable, high output, meaningful, challenging stimulus to the muscles that we're trying to train. So if I had to start from the lower body and I had to go, let's start with calves. So we won't bias gastrocs or soleus. And there's a good conversation to be had about differentiating the two and when you might want to, right? For example, a lot of people focus on the gastroc in sports in general, right? Because the gastroc, when compared to the soleus, it crosses the back of the knee joint and, it offers a little bit of stability to the back of the knee. It offers knee flexion potential as well as obviously plantar flexion. But however, when we look at the sports that, you were concerned about calf strength or Achilles injuries, there's a couple of factors we want to take into consideration. One is mobility at the foot. Ankle mobility is not of a huge concern when it comes to the Achilles and the foot and the ankle complex, because where there's a lot of bones, there should be a lot of movement, right? So bones make joints, joints require some movement. The foot itself has way more joints than the ankle, right? If we think about the ankle from an anatomical perspective, the ankle is really the coming together of the tibia, the fibula, and the calcaneus, the tibia, the fibula, and the talus. And the talus sort of articulates with the calcaneus, and the calcaneus is where the Achilles attaches onto. One of the things that I've noticed in my clinical career is when people have calf and Achilles issues, they tend to have very rigid feet. So their feet don't move a lot. Now, that being said, you're going to make me pick both or pick one of each. So the soleus and the gastroc, the major difference between how you train them, this should be pretty obvious for most people listening, but if not, the soleus is the dominant plantar flexor when the knee is bent. So a seated calf raise will be more soleus, and then a straight leg variation, standing calf raise, for example, would be more soleus. Sorry, standing calf raise would be more gastroc. Spacing out. I miss having Jay here. I'm just talking in the room by myself. So we have these two, and you know what? Maybe I can't break it down to calf. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go soleus seated with shoes on. And for gastroc, we're going to go leg press calf raise, shoes off. So I'm going to bear with me here because we'll talk you through my logic. When we're doing the seated calf raise, I want you to be able to load that as heavy as possible, because the soleus is going to, and sounds counterintuitive. Maybe actually it's right on the money. When we look at the force demands at the ankle when the knee is bent, which would be consistent with the early stages of acceleration, the soleus is going to be the main driver that allows our ankle to be stiff, not the gastroc, right? So I want that to be as loadable as possible. So having shoes on versus shoes off, the reason that when I train the gastroc, I prefer the shoe off is because it's going to force way more mobility through the foot, right? So we're going to have a more underloaded constraint by having the shoe off. And look, it's going to be like uncomfortable, but it's like, first time you pull hook grip, that's also uncomfortable. Just you kind of get used to it, and you scale the weight down and you let your foot become mobile, right? So it's a great way to improve foot strengthening, also strengthen the gastroc. But you'll notice how limited you are in the ability to express strength at your gastroc by the stiffness, the rigidity, and the weakness of your foot, right? So if you had your shoes on, you'd be able to do 300-400 pounds. But you take your shoes off, and that goes, cuts in half, cuts in a quarter. So I would say for gastroc, I would do a leg press calf raise because it's super supported, right? A standing calf raise doesn't have the same benefit as a leg press calf raise. One, you're getting a little bit more length through that posterior chain because your hip's going to be in flexion. So as long as your knees are relatively straight, you're going to get the same benefit. But it's almost like a donkey calf raise, if you guys are old enough to remember those, but in a less suggestive position. So because we're going to be loading the soleus heavy, because the soleus is going to be active in acceleration angles that are going to be requiring of us way more force, right? Like when the knee is bent, when we hit the ground, that's consistent with the early stages of acceleration, where the gastroc is going to be more when the knee is straight and initiating bending, right? So I want that opportunity to mobilize the foot, decrease overall load. And then I want the soleus opportunity, the seated calf raise, shoes on, so we can increase the loadability and really increase the force output in that knee bent position, consistent with those acceleration angles. When the soleus is weak, we really have people, getting really loose through the ankles and not being able to actually express force into the ground. So, okay, we fucked our way through the lower leg, gastroc and soleus. Now going into quads. So I think this is tough because I'm going to kind of explain my rationale here as we do this on the fly. I want to, at some point, introduce I'm going to use like a word that's, can be a little bit inflammatory in some circles, but I want to introduce a gait cycle exercise. Now, to me, the most gait cycle exercise there is lunges. But lunges can have different variations and target different muscle groups depending on how we load them. So in the interest of that, I think I'm going to go, because I kind of have a revolving door of exercises when I'm thinking glute, I'm thinking hamstring, I'm thinking adductor, and I'm thinking quad. So the lunge, wouldn't be fair to put the lunge in. Let's put the lunge in for the quads. So let's do quad lunges. Now you're going to be able to say, look, like it's going to be a fair amount of glute. It could be a fair amount of adductor. But if you set up your stance with and you load accordingly, you can, and you cue the exercise. I would go with walking lunges. Now, why walking lunges over Bulgarian split squats, right? I like the idea of underloading, shifting center of mass completely onto one leg, because it's the only unilateral movement. Like a Bulgarian split squat is not necessarily a unilateral movement. It's a split stance movement, right? There's still going to be that breadth or depth of that base of support. So it is going to be stable, which is what makes it difficult, because you can load a much more weight. But we're going to get to really loadable exercises here shortly when we start to talk about the adductors and the glutes and so on. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go walking lunges, dumbbells, final answer. So that's going to be our quad variation. So we're going to let the knee drift over the toe. You may do this with some sort of heel elevation. I just like the idea of getting that force absorption characteristic, that external to internal rotation of the hip, getting you up on one leg in between reps. These are all constraints, but they're all expressions of movement quality that I think are really useful. And with that comes, again, we're talking big picture of the program here, right? Like if I was talking the best calf raise, I would be like, all right, I'm just going to do leg press. I would say leg press calf raise with shoes on. But because I have a variation with shoes on with the seated, take the shoes off, get some more mobility through the foot, and we're able to sort of temper our overall output by making that consideration. So when we look at lunges for the quads, we're going to look at glute and hamstring, et cetera. And we're going to see where we're going to fill in the gap. So if we go from quad to hamstring, given the rest of the exercises I'm going to choose, I think I'm going to go seated hamstring curl second. So seated hamstring curl, it's machine, high output, length and position. It's going to allow you to target the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. So it actually helps improve, or could potentially help improve tibial internal rotation as well. So there's just a lot of wins with this exercise. And if you want to, big fuck off hamstrings that are good and strong, find yourself a seated hamstring curl, because there's a couple of reasons, and I'm thinking a few steps ahead here. So before we kind of go like, whoa, seated hamstring curl, what about hinges? I think for the glute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a contralaterally loaded B stance dumbbell RDL. This is sort of a junta special. I guarantee you Jay's going to have this on his list. But so we got kind of a kickstand RDL. Now here's the kicker. No pun intended. We need to make sure the shin of the loaded leg stays vertical. I see this trend in hinging that just becomes this balancing act where people rock back onto their heels. So shin angle, right? So the angle in which the foot, the shin leaves the talus. If we don't keep that straight and we're going back into our heels, we're just sort of creating this arbitrary load. We're not in a good position to produce force because their center of mass is too far backwards. So we're sort of relying on the weight to counterbalance us. And this is something that I see really often with the B stance RDL, where people go to hinge and their knee comes backwards, the shin angle goes negative, and they get it out of the glute. They move that tension sort of into this lengthening of the hamstring as their center of mass is too far back. We want to keep the pressure over our midfoot the entire time, so our shin stays more or less vertical and may even come forward a little bit at the end. Like, I want you to think, if you were to draw, and if you're following along at home on YouTube, I highly suggest it. This has got to be like the best looking video recording we've had to date. So check out the movement online, because we're really doing things, Jay Marsh and I, on the quality of the podcast. So head on over to YouTube. I think it's on the Muscle Doc. At the Muscle Doc on YouTube. Subscribe and do all that stuff. But when we're doing the B stance RDL, and if you're following along at home, and it may be useful to do so, is you want to think of like the planes of motion, right? Like if you think of how they decipher sagittal and frontal or coronal, depending on where you're from, and transverse plane, I want you to think of drawing like an ellipsis, or like an orbit. And I want you to think of moving through that orbit. So, the frontal plane, sort of like when you learn it in school, like the coronal plane, is if I was moving through the coronal plane, I'd be moving through this field that divides my ears in half. So that's adduction, lateral flexion. And then we have if I'm moving within the sagittal plane, I have this thing that kind of like cuts my nose in half and my face in half through my nose. And it's like now I'm moving through the sagittal plane. When I think about the fiber orientation of the glute and the kickstand RDL, it's like I'm moving through a plane that exists between, if I had this imaginary line that kind of like chopped my body in half front to back, and I moved within this plane, like some sort of laser field that I disrupted, and I moved through the laser field, like within the dimension. Again, you're going to see me on the internet and I'm going to look like I'm doing I'm a little teapot thing. And the sagittal plane would be the same. Like I had this line that runs through and I'm moving through that line. The line that I'm moving through with a B stance RDL is almost on like a 45 degree of that sagittal line and that transverse line. And it's going to have an expression of both, because I think of like the thumb web of my hand and the arch of my foot being connected, and the trajectory of that ovoid, that ellipsis, that orbit is directly through this sort of oblique plane, right? So as I'm keeping my shin straight and I'm reaching over that foot, I'm feeling the tension from the thumb web of my hand up through my forearm into my lat, into my opposite side glute as I keep that shin over the floor, and then into the arch of my foot and my big toe, my first metatarsal head. So it's not a front to back movement. It's not a side to side movement. It's this oblique movement that exists on this axis. So I'm like, I'm shifting frontal, transverse, and sagittal the entire time. And that movement is almost like my loaded side hip moves back to the corner of the room. And as I come up, I'm moving to the other. It's very oblique in the plane of motion. So I like that one because I'm thinking ahead. We're going to have a hinge movement that is heavy but constrained, because my lat movement or my upper back movement of choice is going to be a pronated grip bent over barbell row. So I'm looking ahead to that hinge position, and that's going to pick up some of my erectors. It's going to force me in this like kind of isometric position. It's going to decrease overall load, right? So when I think glute, I'm thinking about movement quality, I'm going that way, right? So I'm going to go B stance dumbbell contralateral RDL for the glute. You're getting a good stretch, probably one of the better stretches other than maybe a step up. You're getting a lot of movement quality, but you're also kind of keeping some gas in the tank, because something like a leg press is going to be, full send and have a high demand and recovery debt. So where are we at? We're at quads for lunges for quads. We're at B stance RDL, and we're at seated ham for B stance RDL for the glute, contralaterally loaded with a dumbbell, seated ham for the hamstring. Now the adductor machine, I'm going to kind of rule out. Not that it's bad. I would just prefer a stiff leg deficit hinge. So bilateral stiff leg deficit hinge for the adductors. So I'd much rather train the adductor as an extender of the hip than an adductor of the hip. So one thing that I would rather do, and I want you to see how these are moving parts. If I had chosen an exercise like a leg press for the glutes rather than a B stance RDL, I may switch my answer from a stiff leg deadlift from a deficit to something like a machine, right? Because I'm trying to ebb and flow these outputs and inputs of like, okay, I'm really paying attention to the loadability of my spine. I want to make sure that my core and my erectors aren't too fatigued, so I run into issues there, knowing full well that I'm going to have this bent over barbell row. Because I look at the bent over barbell row and I'm like, yeah, that's going to be heavy, but it's not going to be conventional deadlift heavy. But I look at the stiff leg and I go, yeah, it's going to be heavy, but it's not going to be conventional deadlift or even RDL heavy. So I have I'm kind of keeping this system of checks and balances with the overall fatigue as I look to stimulate muscle while simultaneously instilling movement quality. So I love the B stance RDL for just global exposure to the transverse plane, and with that frontal plane movement of the pelvis and internal rotation of the hip. Like there's just so much going on there that'll help keep our program on the rails as we go through, and we meticulously select the other exercises relative to. So we got from the top, and we're going to keep revisiting this list: seated calf raise shoes on, leg press calf raise shoes off, lunges for quads, seated hamstring curl for hamstrings, obviously, B stance contralaterally loaded dumbbell RDL for glutes, stiff leg deficit deadlifts for adductors, and then getting into the back, lats. So I was going to say bent over barbell rows for lats. But I would probably want to do that with a supinated grip. And I don't have the greatest shoulder external rotation these days. So I'm going to use this opportunity to have my lats help me get me in the overhead. Now, I still have decent range of motion through the overhead position. So I'm going to say pronated grip pull-ups. And if you can weight them. Just for the overall shoulder function, it's really hard to beat. And we'll see its friend as well. We'll see the dip come in as my go-to tricep exercise for the same reason as the pull-up. Does it offer something favorable, or are there more favorable exercises if we look at pure hypertrophy stimulus and maybe a little bit more isolation to the lat outside of some of the dynamic stabilizers at the scapula, rhomboids, mid-trap, et cetera? It's like, yeah, for sure. Like that's not a hard claim to make. But again, in the totality of the program, with all the other exercises that we're selecting, this is going to be the move, I think. So we're going to go pull up for lats. We're going to go, what should be our next muscle group? Let's go. So I'm trying to figure out how granular we want to go, because the last thing I want to do is end up having to do one for the anconeus or some sort of really small, seemingly vestigial muscle. So let's go pecs next. Probably going to go incline dumbbell press. Actually, you know what? Let me reconsider. And I'm going to tell you why I reconsider. Because I have dips in as a press, which for me are going to be relatively underloaded just because of the, shoulders a little bit banged up. So I'm never going to be able to really push that, but it will be what allows me to keep my sort of shoulders on the rails enough to really push. So let's go a horizontal press, something really favorable. I'm going to go horizontal cable press. There's a really good Watson variation that I like, or you can just set it up in a chair. So we're going to seated cable press for the pecs. Just we can get through a good range of motion. Your shoulder can find that nice level of abduction that'll allow for the most amount of hyperextension and stretch through the pec. It's going to be heavy, but again, the constraint of loadability. It's going to be, the cable is going to offer a little bit less stability than something like a machine, right? And the reason why is I prefer, just with where my shoulders are at, I prefer to have my delt exercise be a heavy, high incline, almost borderline dumbbell overhead press. So I personally get a lot of benefit out of that as someone who has a pec tear and a bunch of other injuries at the shoulder. I find my program really goes to the dogs when I take that exercise out. So what do we got for the upper body so far? We got lats with pull-ups. We have like a flat machine press, horizontal machine press, maybe even a slight incline. I do like the Atlantis plate loaded incline press, something that's just, good profile, high output, minimal stability demands. So we're probably looking either the machine or the cable, horizontal or high or moderate incline press. Delts, anterior, medial delta have to go overhead press. Going to be a little bit more anterior than medial, but then rear delt will have to factor into its own exercise, which I would say across the board, you're not going to get better than a high to low single arm rear delt fly. I think that's probably just the be all end all when it comes to rear delts as far as isolation movements go. Now they're obviously going to be a part of rowing movements and an inextricable part of most rowing movements, depending on the arm path. But to kind of get them out in the open by themselves, setting up a single cable stack and doing this exercise unilaterally is going to be really, really tough to beat, as opposed to like a machine rear pec deck fly operation, which is just going to be a strategic nightmare to try and find the right arm path for most people. So that's going to be the go-to for the rear delt, is going to be the single arm. Triceps, we got dips. Anterior delts, we got we have overhead shoulder press or high incline, like a 70-degree shoulder press. If I'm breaking down the shoulder press and not considering as a medial delt, I'm going to go dumbbell lateral. And I'm going to go dumbbell lateral because I have a couple of heavy presses. The dumbbell lateral is going to constrain a lot of output when compared to a cable. So I'm going to put that deliberate constraint. We actually were talking about this in L1 lecture here this afternoon about this very principle of like, not all exercises that don't match a resistance profile are bad, because you have to do a number of exercises. So you can actually, wield the understanding of each exercise's, stimulus and fatigue to your advantage to be able to turn things down or turn things up when you want. Like everyone, when they learn a little bit about resistance profiles and strength curves, they just want to turn it up to 11 on every single exercise. It's like, my guy, you're gonna have to be bathing in a bathtub of trenbolone if you're going to want to recover from all this. You're going to have to find exercises that are self-governed in their output based off of sort of the interaction of the relationship of the resistance profile of the movement that you're choosing and the strength profile of the muscle that you're training. So because I have a heavy overhead press, right, which is going to be a lot of output and something that I'm decently strong in, I'm going to take the lateral to the dumbbell because the dumbbell is going to be self-governing in its output, right? And my delts are going to be active in the dip. They're going to be active in the press. So if I go for some like real sweet cable setup with my goniometer and my protractor and my calculator, and I'm trying to just do this resistance curve, strength curve, superimposition, you may be leaving a lot on the table from a recovery standpoint, because you're just burying the needle every single time, right? So because I've picked the other exercise or the other exercises, that's going to help. So anterior delt overhead press, medial delt dumbbell lateral raise, rear delt single arm cable rear delt fly, pecs, cable or machine press. I prefer the Atlantis. Now, where does that leave us? Core. So we could do rectus abdominis. So I think it's worthwhile breaking the core into at least two planes or two groups of either a purely sagittal and a frontal transverse. So I think rope crunch down the middle for sure, or maybe a gar hammer raise. And again, it's going to be dependent on the other exercises I choose. So the second exercise I'm going to choose, and I'll tell you why I went with rope crunch over, maybe something like a gar hammer raise or a rear delt or some rear delt. Jesus Christ, I'm losing my fucking mind. Why I went with a rope crunch over a gar hammer raise or a reverse sit up on a GHR, because I like the loadability of the rope crunch, and that's something that can scale up. Obviously, if you get really strong abs and your body weight's not that much, it can be problematic, but there are ways to set up and rig that so it's not an issue. Because my oblique exercise isn't going to be super scalable. My oblique exercise is going to be a side bend off a bench, just body weight. And again, we're really just leaning into the movement quality stuff. However, when I look at my mid-trap and rhomboid row variation, which is going to be tough to differentiate, and admittedly, this is going to fall a little bit in the lat category as well, is the single arm dumbbell row on a slight incline, right? So supporting myself on a 45-degree incline bench, so my torso is somewhere between, 45 to maybe even a little bit lower, 30 degrees. And so that way it's like the lat that gets prioritized is a more oblique fiber that runs down into the lumbar spine and opposite glutes. So I'm going to kind of set up in this like sumo stance on 45 degrees. If you guys want, it's on my YouTube channel somewhere from like a decade ago. I think I called it the best row ever. So if you want to check out a wicked Canva thumbnail made by yours truly, and a dumbbell row that I still do today, that's going to be under the best row ever. This is about 10 years before everyone on TikTok realized that the lats wrapped around the rib. So, you're welcome. But I digress. So we can call that movement, depending on where your arm path is, like a rhomboid mid-back, mid-trap movement. And this directly ties in to my logic around picking a side bending exercise for my obliques. Is I know that the side bend body weight doesn't necessarily scale past just volume reps and sets, right? I'm not going to add a bunch of weight unless I get really fat, which who knows. But at the same time, it's like I want something progressible through the transverse plane. That dumbbell row, single arm, is going to be very, very progressible. Throw a pair of wrist straps on and say your prayers, and you can really do some work. All the while in the back end, you're going to have this core that's sort of, working through and resisting force through the transverse plane, obliques primarily. And so that's why I'm putting these two exercises together. So the last one that I have, when I think I'm on biceps, this is tough. I'm thinking I'm back and forth between a high cable bicep curl or a bicep curl in the lengthened position. And let's, for the sake of today, just a brief explanation, go with the bicep in the lengthened position. The range of motion of a muscle. So the range of motion of a muscle is different than the range of motion of a joint. When we train full range of motion, we want to be training full range of motion of the muscle. And when we go to train full range of motion of the joint and we negate that these two things are different, we end up in a lot of times in positions that are severely underloaded. And the bicep curl is probably the most egregious variant of this thought process. So if I understand the anatomy of my bicep, right? So you have these sort of like two origins up in the shoulder, one's off the coracoid process, one's off the supraglenoid tubercle. And if I end up putting myself in some sort of like dumbbell arm bar situation, it's not about how long you can get a muscle. It's about how long you can load a muscle, right? So at a certain point, the muscle is as lengthened as it's going to be. And all you end up doing when you start to attempt to lengthen it further is you just change the orientation of that lengthened position and you just change the profile of the exercise. So for some reason, the biceps seem to be the most egregious offender of this. Like when I try to get my arm behind my body and my elbow is at my side, very quickly, I will run out of space inside the glenohumeral joint and my scapula will have to tilt. As my scapula starts to tilt, the two origins of my bicep are now moving in conjunction with the insertion. I have no change in length. So like when you're laying down on a flat bench doing bicep curls and you're in this ridiculously compensated position of shoulder hyperextension and your scaps rolled up, you haven't actually changed. You're probably, whatever degree of hyperextension you're in, you're that many degrees away from the bicep no longer changing length. And now you're in this position where you're changing the relative orientation. And when you change the orientation and you start to put torque on a joint rather than tension on a muscle, you end up decreasing the loadability of that exercise. So it's like when people tend to this ethos of training, a lot of times they just end up underloading these movements because they're putting this joint in a very, very unstable position, which decreases their overall output, right? So full range of motion of joints, a lot of people end up looking like potatoes. Now, if you bang enough trend, like everything kind of works. But if you're someone who's not an enhanced lifter, I've seen this go the wayside. Now, look, there are some exercises where mindlessly going as far as you can go into the movement is useful. The biceps is just not one of them, right? The bicep, and look, most people aren't going to do this as their only bicep exercise, and your biceps are going to be active, when you're rowing or, when you're just lifting dumbbells off the rack. If you get strong enough, that everything's going to help at a certain point. But the idea that I'm going to break my elbow in half with some sort of medieval bicep torture device and I'm getting extra magical length, it's just not the case. Because again, it's not as long as you can get a muscle, it's as long as you can load a muscle. If you don't understand the arthrokinematics behind the skeletal implications of lengthening and shortening muscles, you're really shooting in the dark. So my bicep exercise I'm going to choose is the lengthened variation because I like having big arms, but it's not the lengthened variation that's on YouTube. right? It's the lengthened variation that really makes sense and is loadable, right? Like I always compare it to that scene in Super Troopers. It's like, the kids are pulled over and they're high as fuck, and cops are fucking with them, and they're like, pull over. And it's like, hey, we are pulled over. You can't pull over anymore. He's already pulled over. It's like, once a muscle is lengthened, that's it. Lengthened, right? Like people are stretching their biceps like it's got some sort of international homeland security secret or something. It's just like torturing. It's like, oh, dude, you're just changing the interaction with the resistance profile. It's long. It's long. Now you're just moving the joint into a shitty position and making you grab smaller dumbbells. Don't do that. Don't do that, because smaller dumbbells mean smaller muscles in most cases where trend isn't involved. So did we do it? Let me run it back. Let me run it back from the top and make sure we don't have any holes. So lower body, starting from the ground up, we have a gastroc and a soleus variation for the lower leg. The gastroc variation is a leg press calf raise. Love that. Straight knee, but a ton of support. I will choose this exercise over a standing calf raise regardless. Now, I'll do it with shoes on in most cases, but in this hypothetical scenario where I have to think of movement quality, I'll do a leg press calf raise with shoes off and really focus. And look, you're going to trim the weight right down, but don't worry. We're going to have it'll get stronger. It'll get heavier as your feet get stronger. And two, we're going to have a soleus variation that's loadable with shoes on. It's just the soleus is going to be more implicated in those lower joint angles that are consistent with a need for the soleus to be active, right? We're producing force and acceleration. Seated calf raise, shoes on is going to be the one. Moving up into the quad, we're going to lunge with dumbbells. Dumbbells allow the shoulders to reciprocate. You're going to allow for a really nice absorption of force, underloading, true unilateral stance in the swing phase of the movement. So just a lot of and again, you're picking up more than obviously quad. You're going to get some adductor, you're going to get some glute, etc. Moving into the hamstrings, seated hamstring curl machine, high output, like the hamstrings to be long, strong, tibial internal rotation. A lot of benefits there. Glute, V stance RDL. We're going to see some hinging in other parts. We're going to get our stiff legs in for our adductors, so we get a decent amount of hinging in. Don't need to be, ripping 7-8 plates off the floor. Grab a dumbbell and a wrist strap, opposite hand to the side that's forward, and you're off to the races. So really think as far as full length of the glute, going unilateral, split stance position, allowing for frontal and transverse plane access. Ton of benefit in global rotation, even into the spine and ribs, into the obliques. I think that bang for buck is up there. It's obviously a junta special if anyone's ever followed along at home. And then adductors, stiff leg deadlift with a barbell off a deficit, good range. You're going to get some erector in there as well. I think a good way to really strengthen, stabilize the spine and pelvis rather than sitting down on some adductor machine. Which again, there's a way to parse this out where the adductor machine is meaningful, but we're trying to keep a system of checks and balances as far as what goes where in relation to the other movements. So that's lower body done. Into the lats, pull-ups all day. If you need to do a assisted pull-up, some sort of assisted machine or band, cool. I just like to see the expression of upward rotation of the scaps, gets the ribs moving, gets some eccentric rhomboid, but at the end of the day, it's going to get the lat moving a fair amount. Is it the most optimal? Not really, but is having functional shoulders optimal? Absolutely. So that's going to set the stage for the rest of our movement. So getting into like the mid-trap, rhomboid, hard to differentiate those two in some circles, but I think the bent over pronated grip barbell row will get a little bit of extra hinging in, but again, it's loaded. A lot of reactive stability in the deep spine because you're holding this hinge position while the arm and barbell are swinging off in front of you. It's an exercise that I absolutely love in any kind of rehab setting because the perturbation of the arm offers a lot of reactive stimulus to the deep spine. So when you get good at it, we don't have to worry about the deep spine. Your erectors get lit up, and you also get some exposure to a hinge position for something that looks a little bit like an isometric, which is also great. So we have pull-ups, we have bent over barbell rows. I threw the single arm dumbbell row in there as well. So that could be like, all right, rhomboid, mid trap, whatever. I would say probably more rhomboid with the dumbbell row. Again, profile standpoint, is it ideal? Not at all. But is it ideal from integrating something that's loadable with a ton of movement quality? Yes. And that's why it's in the programs, because we have other exercises that help fill in the gaps of loadability. We have the exercise that sort of slide the scales of loadability to increase movement quality. So one of the reasons we're using that one is because our core exercise in the frontal and transverse plane is going to be just a body weight side bend. Right? So I want to be able to turn that up and be able to really add some weight to it. So let's take on core side bend for the obliques, just off 2 feet up on a bench, hand on the ground, get the pelvis moving. Think of the ribs and the pelvis like a joint, right? And the lumbar spine is sort of like the central, the hinge of these two joints. So I'm trying to open that 12th rib and that iliac crest up and then close it down. Get some complementary breathing in there as well. Really good exercise. But again, not super scalable because it's just body weight, but we have the dumbbell row, which is super scalable and starts to work through similar planes of motion, challenging similar muscles. Triceps dips, machine assisted, or body weight, or adding weight, resisted belt dips. All great exercise. That love the integrated internal rotation of the shoulders, upward rotation of the scaps, and the introduction of the lower trap at the top of the movement to pull the shoulders away from the ears. Like, really tough to beat that exercise. Delts, anterior delt, high incline 70-degree overhead dumbbell press. Medial delt, lateral raise with a dumbbell. Rear delt, single arm, high to low rear delt cable fly. Very adaptable for anthropometry. So depending on someone's structure, I can change the angle very easily. So we're going to go ahead and throw that in for the rear delt, which leaves us with pec, machine press or cable press. Again, cable press or machine. Cable will offer you a little bit more variability, a little bit more specificity, because you have a little bit more freedom of movement to actually adjust the position of the cables as opposed to a machine. Machine's going to offer you a little bit more output. I would probably stick horizontal here, because we have sort of like an incline variant with a high press, and we have a decline variant with the dips, one being for delt, one being for shoulders, one being for triceps primarily. And then lastly, the bicep curl, low incline press. So we hadn't really talked about upper traps. I love shrugs. I would say overhead shrugs. But I think in the case of everything we've talked about, dumbbell shrugs I like. They're self-contained because you only go so heavy before it's just kind of relatively untenable. So yeah, dumbbell shrugs with wrist straps. I think that's a wrap. So what we're going to do is I'm going to prompt Jay with this podcast. I'm like, hey, Jay, your next pod is exercise per muscle group in relation to all the other muscle groups. And I'm going to see what he says. I know we picked the best exercise or exercise that we'll do forever, but I don't think he's ever picked in relation to other exercises. So that'll be where we go next with this. If I'm going to wrap for today, if you have any questions on this, shoot me a message. I think this is how we have to look at exercise programming. And I think, the antithesis of this video, or videos that are the antithesis of this, where we just look at the best exercise, which like I've done, obviously, I'm a jackass just like everyone else. Like I put a video on the internet called The Best Row Ever. But I want you to see how it's always the best in relation to all the other exercises you're doing, right? And hopefully this video is some insight into how that engine works, like how that thought process of training works. So we'll leave you guys with that for the week. L1, you want to talk about this stuff in more detail. What do you think we talk about in L1? So L1 is for sale right now. Link in the show notes, www.pre-script.com. So if you're listening to this before November 1st, 2025, you can still register. If you're not, you can still register anyway. So if we're not up for registration when you're listening, you can just drop your name in and you'll be the first to know. We offer a discount code for early registrants. So if you guys are on the waiting list, you will get a discount. If not, you guys enjoy the rest of the week. We'll see you next week. Actually, I think it's Jay back next week, and we'll be back in studio a few weeks after that. So you guys enjoy the rest of the weekend, and Jay, we'll see you next week.